On this episode of Death Row Stories,
we had a stabbing homicide.
A brutal murder in a Phoenix bar.
She was on her back. Her clothing was strewn around the restroom.
And a gruesome signature left at the scene.
We thought we had a murderer with a disfigured tooth.
Crooked teeth put bite mark science on trial, and an Air Force veteran on death row.
There was no way that Ray's teeth could have made those marks.
The blood didn't match, the fingerprints didn't match.
They hid this evidence until the very last minute.
They wanted the death penalty. They were going to do everything they could to make sure it happened.
This was our justice system, but it turned out that this system ain't about the truth.
There's a body in the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
It was December 28th, 1991. Kim Ancona was a single mother. She had just had a wonderful new thing in her life. She was a bartender who had just been made a manager of the CBS bar in Phoenix, Arizona.
Innocence and pleasure rarely meet. The CBS Lounge was a nice bar to go to. Like a rose. It was in a strip mall in Phoenix.
I worked literally right behind the bar she was working at, so I would stop on my way into work or on my way home from work, stop in and hang out with her, have a couple of Cokes, and play darts. I would see her every day.
That night, when we were getting ready to leave the bar, for Kim closing up, we asked her if she needed any help. She said no, that she was going home.
She had called me and asked me if I could find her a bag of weed. And I told her I would try. And I called her back later. I was unsuccessful, and she said that was fine. And that was the last time I spoke to her.
In the early morning hours of December 29th, 1991, the owner of the CBS Lounge arrived to open the bar.
The first thing he noticed was that the front door was open. It had not been locked. So he went in. Everything looked like it had been cleaned up, but he noticed that Kim Ancona's purse was on the bar. Then he went into the men's room and saw her body.
I got a call to roll up to 17th Avenue in Camelback, which is where CBS was. We had a stabbing homicide. There could have been sexual assault.
She was on her back. She was naked. Her clothing was strewn around the restroom. It had been cut off her body. She had multiple wounds around her neck, around her body.
Kim Ancona had been stabbed from behind multiple times with a kitchen knife. Detectives found the murder weapon in the bathroom trash can.
The knife was actually bent significantly. Later at autopsy, it was determined that probably occurred when the knife hit bone, which indicates somebody very powerfully stabbed her. So this was just a horrific crime.
I was riding my 10-speed to work and cutting through that parking lot, and I saw the yellow tape around her car. And as I rode up, I wanted to see what was going on because, of course, my mom's car was covered in tape, and one of the detectives took me aside, and he said that my mother is no longer with us and that she's been killed. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. To be honest, I'm still in shock, It's probably the worst thing that I could have ever heard.
At the crime scene, police examined Kim's body and discovered strange marks on her torso.
They saw on the body lesions that looked like bite marks, both on her neck and on her left breast. So they called a dentist who worked for the medical examiner's office, Dr. John Piakis.
They were distinctive bite marks in that the teeth didn't really line up the way you would see them on your Crest commercial or whatever, so we thought we had somebody with a disfigured tooth.
Police began questioning the bar's patrons and employees. One name kept coming up.
Several people that we talked to got the name Ray as somebody that she had been out with.
Some of Kim Ancona's friends told the police that Ray was a friend of hers. They had suggested he's like a boyfriend. So they thought, well, we're going to go talk to Ray.
35-year-old Ray Krone lived just a few blocks from the CBS Lounge. A mailman with no criminal record, he was a regular at the bar.
I had heard his name before because my mom had a little bit of a crush on him. Thought he was a handsome guy. The one time I did see him at the bar, my mother had asked him to substitute on her dart team. At the end of the dart tournament, she asked him to pay the entry fee, and he got really upset. He raised his voice and pretty much stormed out of the bar.
I went over to his house. It's really not far from the bar. He responded to our questions. The key, as far as we were concerned, was he didn't have perfect teeth.
Krone denied being in a relationship with Kim Ancona, and his roommate told police he had been home all night. Police brought Krone to the station and collected samples of his hair, saliva, and blood.
And at the end of the interview, they asked Ray to bite into this section of the styrofoam paper plates. And then they took that to Dr. Piakis, and Dr. Piakis said, well, that's consistent with the murderer.
Police took impressions of Krone's teeth to create a plaster model. When they compared them to the bite marks on Kim's body, they appeared to line up. A day later, on New Year's Eve, Ray Krone was arrested and charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder.
I was 14. It wouldn't have happened. I believe it was a day or two before the funeral. I had heard that on the news they had caught somebody, and they said his name. It didn't help very much, but I had some relief that the person who did it was going to be punished.
Krone's court-appointed attorney suggested he plead guilty and take a deal. He refused.
He wasn't going to take a deal. He said, I didn't do it. And I will tell you that in the 20 years I was in homicide, I heard that every time. I didn't do it.
Ray Krone's trial began on July 29, 1992. Veteran prosecutor Noel Levy was determined to seek the death penalty.
Noel Levy was a career prosecutor who had a very good reputation, had done a number of very high-profile cases. He had a background in the military. He was a military intelligence officer.
Levy would focus his case on the bite marks left behind by the killer. His star witness was Dr. Raymond Rawson, a dentist and Nevada state senator. On the stand, Rawson produced a compelling exhibit, a video comparing Krone's teeth to the marks on Kim's body.
I had never seen a videotape of that type ever used by anyone else. It took hundreds and hundreds of hours to create that video. He used 2 cameras and then he put the pictures together, and that videotape was very convincing.
Kim's oldest son, Chris, sat in the courtroom.
It was really hard because I was only 18 years old. To be honest, I shouldn't have been in there. They shouldn't have allowed me in there. There's just things that I shouldn't have heard. The bite marks, shouldn't have seen any of that. The whole case was very traumatizing.
After an 8-day trial, the jury delivered their verdict. Ray Krone was guilty of kidnapping and murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to death.
It took the jury a little over 3 hours to find me guilty. You kind of sit there like you're watching a tennis match, and you're actually being the ball that's being hit back and forth. Everything that I stood for and believed in, the justice system was gone.
On December 3rd, 1992, Ray Krone entered death row at the notorious Casten prison in Florence, Arizona.
The death row in Arizona is complete isolation. You have no physical contact with other inmates. The cell was about 6 by 8. I could stand in the middle of it and just about touch the walls. And then out a small window where you could look out across the desert. And that's it. You were in your cell. You got 2 phone calls a month.
The atmosphere in Maricopa County in 1991 was a very law and order oriented judicial system. There was a lot of pressure on judges in particular to get these trials done, and they wanted the death penalty. They were going to do everything they could to make sure it happened.
To visit her son, Ray's mother, Carolyn, traveled 2,500 miles from Pennsylvania.
The experience of visiting someone on death row when they bring them into the cubicle on the other side of the glass was a very, very hard thing to see.
I remember seeing the look in my mom's eye. I'm shackled at the waist and ankles, and I'm shuffling in a jumpsuit. And how do you let your loved ones know that I'm okay, I'll be okay, you know, it's all right. I grew up in Dover, Pennsylvania, farm country. I went to the same high school my grandparents went to, the same church my great-grandparents went to. We enjoyed that outdoor country life.
Ray was the most pleasant, happy-going, easy to raise child. Always a lot of fun. All the way through high school, Ray was involved in activities and scouts and church and things.
After high school, Ray signed up for the Air Force. He was stationed in Savannah, Georgia, when a car accident left him with severe injuries.
I woke up in the hospital, my mouth wired shut, I had a broken jaw.
After that accident, Ray's appearance had changed some because his teeth had been badly damaged and his jaw had been broken. And so when they wired it together and it re-healed, his teeth were crooked.
I remember how painful it was having a broken jaw. I'll never forget that wired shut mouth and the pain that brings around your teeth and gum area.
In 1980, Ray moved to Phoenix and took a job with the post office. On the side, he was an avid dart player, and he often stopped by to compete at the CBS Lounge, sometimes with bartender Kim Ancona.
Kim was a bubbly, outgoing person. She worked there, and it turned out then that she also had a dart team.
My mom was the captain of their dart team, so she was very into darts. We used to play a lot of darts together in the bar and at home, but I could never beat her.
She was a nurse, but she saw kids deteriorating, seeing some pass away, and it was really affecting her, so she stopped doing that to be a bartender.
My mother was very hardworking. Family was always first. She did whatever she could to keep a roof over us, keep us fed.
She would come home from work and sleep for about 3 or 4 hours and then get us off to school. She had that nurturing heart, and she was hilarious. She was the life of the party.
In the early 90s, my mother was going through a divorce. My brother and sister were staying with our stepfather because I wasn't home anymore, and she had lost her home because of the divorce and all that. She was trying to get back on her feet.
She was happy to get all these hours working at the CBS Lounge because she wanted the money so that she could have her own house with her kids.
She wanted to get her family back together, and that's the move she was making when all of this happened.
For 2 years, Ray Krone sat on death row. while his mother Carolyn fought for his case. The family eventually brought on defense attorney Christopher Plord.
I first met Ray Krone in June of 1994. I traveled to death row in Arizona, and I interviewed him for a number of hours.
Chris wasn't a man that seemed like just be going through the motions and asking routine questions, because this was a man that cared.
Early on, I got the notion that Ray was, one, not the type of person that would do this, but I walked out of there and he was just like one of my brothers, you know.
That man from that day on was one of my strongest defenders and fought for me the whole way through.
When he dug into the case, Plord realized the main evidence against Ray, Dr. Rawson's bite mark video, had been revealed to the defense just 2 days before trial.
They hid this evidence until the very last minute, when of course there was not time for the defense to do any kind of counteraction.
Why in the world would the state try to get into evidence a videotape that had been disclosed but 2 days before trial?
The appeals court said, "Are you kidding me? You have got to disclose to the defense what evidence you have."
After nearly 3 years on Arizona death row, Ray Krone was granted a second chance to prove his innocence. But as attorney Chris Plord prepared for Ray's second trial, he found himself stymied by prosecutor Noel Levy.
I wanted to get access to the evidence from the police department, and Noel Levy objected to that. He would refuse to give me notes from the crime lab, access to the evidence. And then once he was ordered by the Supreme Court to give me discovery, he went to every interview and essentially knew that he was in for a long fight.
Among the evidence the state finally handed over were 17 hairs found on Kim Ancona's body. Of these, 2 came from an unidentified person, and another was never tested.
They said that some of them were Kim's, and others could not be ruled out as being Ray's. That wasn't even true.
The reality is when you look at the evidence hairs, were from a person who was either Mexican-American, Hispanic, or American Indian. So Krone could not, and Ancona could not have been the donors of those hairs.
Chris also received police files showing footprints recovered from the scene, matching size 9.5 Converse sneakers.
Ray Krone didn't have Converse shoes, and he wore an 11.
They basically reanalyzed the latent prints, and they came up with an opinion that the size was consistent with Mr. Krone, even though he didn't own those type of shoes.
Finally, blood collected from the crime scene tested as type O. Noel Levy said that matched Ray, but it also matched back to Kim Ancona.
You have to remember, in the early 90s, we knew DNA was coming, but it wasn't coming to Phoenix right away. We were still blood typing. They would be able to say that it was AB or O. Back then, ABO was about as good as you were going to get.
It was amazing the number of things that they did try to do a test on, but if it didn't match me, they ignored it. They're not looking for anybody else. They only wanted stuff that matched me.
Ray's second trial would begin on February 16, 1996.
Noel Levy's theory of the case was virtually the same as it was in the first trial. That Ray Krone was essentially the boyfriend of Kim Ancona, and that unless Ray Krone loaned his teeth to somebody, Ray Krone is the killer.
Noel Levy was an extremely effective prosecutor. Very tall, very persuasive, could mesmerize a jury, would make declaration statements that make them sound like they came right out of the Bible.
Levy argued that Ray and Kim had been romantically involved, and that Ray killed her in a jealous rage.
This boyfriend-girlfriend thing kept coming up. I kept telling her, look, I know her from the bar, that's it, she hasn't been to my house, I'm not her boyfriend.
Ray did not even know her last name at the time that she was killed. She was just Kim from the bar.
Daniel Miller, Kim's youngest son, attended the second trial, and saw Ray in person for the first time.
For those 4 years, I built up a lot of hatred towards Ray. And to see him 20 feet from me, I wanted to jump over the wall and cause physical harm. I believed in an eye for an eye, and I wanted him to be put to death for what he did.
When it came time to address the jury, Plord attacked the state's case piece by piece.
Chris proved that blood didn't match, the fingerprints didn't match, and they're eliminating all these things. So we really felt good about that.
The truth was coming out, but I was starting to feel positive about the system again. But it didn't take long to realize that they were serious about believing that I'd done it and were going to make sure that I was going to pay for this murder one way or another.
As Ray Krone faced the death penalty for the second time, he was facing off against a respected scientific field. Forensic odontology, or the science of bite marks, had come to prominence in the late 70s when serial killer Ted Bundy was convicted with the help of Dr. Norman Sperber.
Dr. Sperber was considered the leading forensic odontologist in the country, and he saw this evidence in Ray's case early on.
I ran into Dr. Sperber in San Diego in the courthouse, and then he asked me, he said, "What case are you involved in Arizona?" And I said, "Well, the Krone case, the guy's on death row." He was shocked because he had concluded before the first trial that there was just not enough information there to conclude it was Ray's teeth, and that information was never given to the defense attorney.
Prosecutor Noel Levy eventually hired Dr. Raymond Rawson to analyze the evidence.
Noel Levy paid Mr. Rawson $50,000 to show a jury how these teeth marks matched. He created a video in a system that nobody understood, and this video was unbelievably convincing.
At the time, computer technology wasn't what it is today, but he was doing some image correction to make the comparison on these breast models and demonstrating how Ray's teeth made a match.
And he apparently was able to manipulate the images to, in fact, change the size of Ray Krone's teeth to match the bite mark.
To counter Rawson, Plord called 3 top odontologists who testified that Ray's teeth were not a conclusive match.
He measured the teeth from canine to canine. There was no way that Ray's teeth could have made those marks. But in the video, it looked like they lined up perfectly. So I basically said Ray Rawson is a charlatan and a fraud, that he had no scientific method.
The state had also produced molds of Ray's teeth that seemed to be a match, but Plord argued otherwise.
There was a video that was done of the police department examining the body of Kim Ancona.
They took the mold of Ray's mouth and they put it on her body. And they twisted this mold to fit into the marks on her body. They twisted and turned it, therefore possibly creating the match with Ray's teeth. Because, of course, this flesh is now dead, and they're not going to retain whatever you've done.
Then what they did is they took molds of the breast, and they used those in the video also to show that there was a correlation between Ray's teeth and the bite mark based upon the mold.
While the medical examiner's office denied affecting the evidence, presiding Judge James McDougall did find credence in other defense arguments.
I thought the defense, they did an excellent job of creating doubt. I came away from that thinking, well, that's not as clear as it looked when the state rested.
Now there was the bite mark experts that said it wasn't me. Saliva on the bite mark wasn't me. Hair wasn't me. Just so many things now to come out that never, ever came out in the first trial.
Ray's trial would last 7 weeks. It took the jury 3 days to render their verdict.
When the jurors came into the courtroom and had to face us that day, I had an uneasy feeling that they were avoiding looking at us.
The verdict was announced. It was all in slow motion.
First degree, we find the defendant, Ray Krone, guilty.
Jay just said guilty, guilty. Whoa, back up, wait a minute, what's going on here? This can't be possible. What are they saying? And I just couldn't believe it.
After all these weeks and days and hours, to hear that verdict is like doomsday. I mean, no, not all this, and here we are where we started.
What more evidence, what more could we possibly have done to convince the jury of my innocence? How is this possible?
I was taken aback when they came back with a judgment of guilt. I felt that the defense had created serious doubt about all the other evidence, including the bite mark evidence.
During deliberation, the jury had requested 2 pieces of evidence: the mold of Kim's breast made at the autopsy and the cast of Ray's teeth.
Basically, the jurors, they took the molds finally, they passed them around and they fit the mold with the teeth.
When we used the molds, the teeth fit the marks that were on the breast mold. And I tried it myself, and there was no doubt. I keep wondering about why we sat through all that, teaching us about hair and fibers and blood, and none of it mattered. If he bit her, he killed her.
While the jury found Ray guilty, the decision whether to accept that verdict rested with Judge James McDougall.
They heard all the evidence. They were 12 of 24 people that had reached that decision, but there just was a nagging feeling that we hadn't gotten the right person here.
Ray Krone had been found guilty a second time of killing Kim Ancona. But Judge James McDougall struggled over whether to accept the jury's decision.
Even though I disagreed with the verdict, it's not something I could easily just set aside. But that lingering doubt was enough to make me feel that I can't sentence this man to death.
Ultimately, Judge McDougall sentenced Ray to life in prison, but he also issued a remarkable statement.
He said, quote, "The court is left with a residual or lingering doubt about the clear identity of the killer. This is one of those cases that will haunt me for the rest of my life, wondering whether I have done the right thing."
For Judge McDougall to give Ray a life verdict as opposed to a death verdict was not something that was well received by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So for him to do anything more than that, I think he would have been run out of town and he would have lost his job.
Ray was sent to general population in the spring of 1996, where his former death sentence earned him respect. But all that changed one day when a television program came on the air.
I was in my room that day, and a guy knocked on the window and said, "Hey, you better check out Channel 4, you're on TV." I'm like, "What?" And I turned my TV on Channel 4, and here was Arrest and Trial.
Ray Krone, a 32-year-old postal worker.
And in that film, the 2 detectives say that when they got to Ray's red Corvette, they opened up the trunk and there were bloody sheets in there.
And we later found out through the crime lab investigation that the blood came back to Kim Ancona.
There was no blood traced back to Kim in his possession.
They got pictures of me running down the road that said I was charged with sexual assault.
Based upon the evidence, Ray Krone wanted to have sex with Kim Ancona that night. He was just shaking. He was so nervous. He couldn't believe it.
Sexual assault ain't accepted in the prison, so even the people that had known me for about a year or so were now about to cut my throat just because of that episode there of making it sound like I had raped and assaulted this woman.
When they convicted Ray this time, it was clear to me that the justice system was not going to solve this case if we ever wanted to get Ray freed. It was a matter of, now we're going to have to solve this case.
Ray's last hope lay with finding the real killer. To investigate, the defense brought on former homicide detective Thomas Streed.
One of the things that the police department was made aware of was the fact that a neighbor living across from the CBS lounge, saw a Native American leaning against the wall of CBS lounge by himself during the early morning hours. He essentially wrote out a note to the police. He said, "The man you're looking for appears to be an American Indian."
There was one woman that knew Kim that was in the bar, and she identified an American Indian drinking in the bar that night that Kim Ancona had kicked out.
Kim and I were laughing at this one guy who was all westerned out, but then he had a pair of ugly tennis shoes on. He wanted another beer, and she said, "No, I'm cutting you off. You've had enough." That probably made him mad. I told Noel Levy that I believed that Ray Krone did not do this, and that the guy that was at the bar, I said, we give him all reason to do this because he got cut off. But Levy was cranky with me. He was set that Ray Krone did it, his teeth marks.
Detectives investigated Terry's tip without success. But by 1998, law enforcement was developing a new tool, a national DNA database called CODIS.
I glommed onto that as the Ray's salvation, that these databases are going to eventually get populated, and then we could put the profile into the database and find out who actually killed Kim Ancona.
By 2001, Ray's team believed CODIS was strong enough for a new round of tests. They filed motions for access to Kim Ancona's clothing.
I wanted to see all of her garments, all of her clothing, because when an individual is in the process of carrying out an assault on someone with an edged weapon, with a knife, their hand slips off of the grip over the blade. They accidentally cut themselves. So this individual's blood might have wound up on the victim's clothing.
We originally requested a DNA testing in October. It was granted by the judge, and we were told it would take 6 to 8 weeks. So November went by, December went by, January went by, and we still ain't heard no results. We're like, what's going on? And then it turned out that they actually had the test results done. They didn't like the results because it identified somebody else.
A DNA profile was uploaded into the CODIS National DNA Database. Whether the person that did the crime was in the database, that was a shot in the dark. But in the end, they got a hit towards a person named Ken Phillips.
Kenneth Phillips was a Hopi Indian that lived about 500 yards from the CBS lounge. He was a hardcore drinker. He had a record of sexual assault.
Phillips was already in prison for sexual assault, and he matched the description given to police on the morning of the murder.
I called up Noel Levy and I said, you have to release Ray Krone, and you have to release him now. And he said, no, that's a tentative hit. That's just a mistake. It's a fluke.
With the prosecutor's office dragging their feet, Ray's forensic investigator, Thomas Streed, visited Phillips in prison.
We were seated at a table in the cafeteria, and I said, you must have felt absolutely horrible coming home that night, all covered with all of that blood.
Over the course of the interrogation, Phillips recalled an altercation with Kim Ancona, and later, waking up with blood on his hands.
After the conversation with him ended, we were convinced that he was absolutely, unequivocally, without any question whatsoever, the sole individual responsible for Kimberly Ancona's murder.
Streed's suspicions were confirmed when the hair and fingerprints found on the scene matched back to Kenneth Phillips.
And here's the great part. Kenneth Phillips does not have crooked teeth. Their entire theory that only someone with crooked teeth could have bit that woman on the breast as he killed her was wrong from the start.
On April 8, 2002, Ray received a phone call from his defense team.
My attorney, he said, Ray, how you doing today? I said, fine, just another day in paradise. He laughed. Then he said, well, what are you hungry for? You want seafood, Mexican food, steak, a beer? What would you like? I said, what are you talking about? I'll eat whatever's in the chow. He said, I just got off the phone with the prosecutor's office. They just got back from the judge's chambers. They're cutting the paperwork. You're coming home today. And of course, what did you just say? He said, roll up, Ray. It's all over. You're coming home.
I drove over to the prison in Arizona, and I could hear a big, clapping and yelling and so forth.
They're all jumping up down here. They had TV was on. It was saying about how I was being released, and they're all, still some emotional things happened that I still remember. But they're jumping up and down in their beds saying, go home, Ray Krone, go home, Ray Krone. They're all excited for me because they just seen on TV, it was just announced that I was being released.
As soon as I got the call that Ray was being released, I called my husband and Ray's younger brother, and the three of us drove straight through 27 hours to Phoenix. Oh man, it was like to see him standing on free ground and able to touch him and talk to him, and it was like, this is what we've been waiting for, and now it finally happened. It was a dream.
Now, nothing's gonna keep us away from Ray for as long as we want, and he can eat what he wants and go where he wants and wear what he wants and say what he wants, and it's gonna be great.
I got a phone call from a friend, said, you need to turn on the TV right now. And I turned it on, and they were talking about letting him go. At first, I was in shock. Why? What's going on? And as I listened to the rest of the story, they said, based off of DNA evidence, and that is when it clicked. He really didn't do it.
During the trial, he seemed very cocky and confident, and that made me feel a lot of anger. I realized why he was like that, because he was innocent.
Kenneth Phillips eventually pleaded guilty to the murder of Kim Ancona. He was sentenced to 53 years in prison.
We owed it to Kim to find the man who really killed her, not to send an innocent man to prison. Kim deserves so much better. Her family deserves so much better.
I actually apologized to Ray. I wrote him. I told him that I'm very thankful that he was proven innocent, and then him losing 11 years of his life for something he didn't do. It was really heartbreaking. I felt guilty.
After spending over a decade in prison, Ray Krone became the 100th death row exoneree in the United States.
People started to question, how could a regular person be put on death row and convicted not once but twice based upon bite mark evidence?
And so bite mark analysis, is it a valuable crime-fighting tool, or is it junk science? Ray Krone's story, I think what most people see and worry about is that there could be others like him that were convicted on this sort of science that got it wrong.
Ray's story was a horror story. This is a totally innocent guy who gets caught up in the egos and incompetence of people in Arizona and ends up losing 10 years of his life. It was a travesty of justice. I would hope people in Arizona had learned from the Ray Krone case, but I wouldn't bet my life on it.
I lost complete faith in the entire system. And that's when I started realizing and thinking, he's probably not the only one, and this has happened a lot.
If they can put me on death row, they can put anybody on death row. I didn't have a record. I'm not a monster. I'm a veteran. I work for the post office. And so I share my story with civilians, of people in law school, people in colleges, people in churches that one day might serve on a jury. Just make sure you got beyond reasonable doubt that they are guilty, that just because they were arrested doesn't mean they did something. If we kill them, we can't bring them back, and we found out we made a mistake. And we do make mistakes.